Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Special Education News and Noteworthy, the podcast where we break down the latest news impacting special education across the country and talk about what it means for students, families, educators, and advocates. I'm Paige Fitzgerald.
And I'm Kate McGaldy.
Before we jump in, a quick reminder that you can now follow Special Education News and Noteworthy wherever you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, you name it, you can probably follow us there. And if you're enjoying the show, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave us a 5-star rating. It helps more families, educators, and advocates find this conversation, and it supports our mission of making special education information more accessible.
This week, we're looking at proposed changes to Head Start that could affect children with disabilities, a push to further restrict seclusion and restraint in Michigan schools, and 3 stories that raise important questions about school choice. What does having more options actually mean for students with disabilities if those options are not accessible to them? So let's get started.
The Trump administration is proposing a major overhaul of Head Start's federal standards, reducing more than 130 pages of program requirements to roughly a dozen. Among the proposed changes would be the elimination of federal requirements related to services, including developmental screenings and individualized supports for children with disabilities, as well as current requirements around adult-to-child ratios. Programs could instead rely more heavily on state and local child care licensing standards. The administration says the changes would reduce bureaucracy, give local programs more flexibility, and potentially allow Head Start to serve more children. Advocates and Head Start providers, however, are concerned that removing these federal requirements could weaken some of the comprehensive services that distinguish Head Start from traditional childcare, particularly services that help identify and address developmental and disability-related needs early. It's important to note that these changes are proposed and are not yet final. The proposal is subject to a public comment period.
When I first read this article, my first reaction was like, whoa, that's a major overhaul, right? Cutting 130 pages of federal standards down to about a dozen is like night and day. And I think we're always trying to trim things down and make sure that things are very concise and the best it can be. But this is trimming the red tape down well below what the norm would be. Fundamentally, I think the entire model changes at this point, given that it went from 130 federal standards down to a dozen. It's not what it used to be, or it might not. I know that it's proposed.
This is just a proposal, but it still is concerning. And changing, trying to get rid of the Department of Education, right? Because they want to give more powers to the states. But then it becomes, okay, so now you're going to just kind of leave it to chance, right, for how these states want to implement and run their Head Starts. These screenings are important to do. It should be nationwide that they are doing these screenings. A lot of the regulations in there are really so that there is a gold standard for how Head Start is run, and they all are operating by the same playbook. You're taking out more than half of the playbook. If this were to go through and happen, it's going to really now begin to be then, okay, well, depending on what state you're in, depends on the quality and
the consistency.
Yeah, the consistency and quality of the program. And you could then be in a state that doesn't choose to adopt those early screenings for early intervention services.
Yeah.
And it would just be really, it would be like, okay, fingers crossed, hope we're in the state that decides to keep most of those things in. And if they don't, whoop. So, this is another thing where I'm sure there's going to be a lot of pushback. And this is going to be something that, once again, when we get updates on it, we will let everyone know.
Right. But also, I think crucial time for anybody that can be involved. It's this is where public input is really crucial. So when you're understanding the story, you have some feelings about it, speak up, because it's going to really impact things for better or for worse.
Yeah. And like you're saying, let your public representatives know that this is not something that you are for, right? So and usually there are organizations that you can type in your zip code and it will tell you who your local elected official is that you can write to. And sometimes they'll even give you a little paragraph or two that you can send their way. So there are ways, even if you're super busy or I don't know what to say, that you can make your voice heard.
True. Great. Okay, our second story comes from Bridge, Michigan. Michigan lawmakers could soon start considering new restrictions on seclusion and restraint in schools after students were secluded or restrained nearly 18,000 times during the 2024-2025 school year. The vast majority of those incidents involve students with disabilities. State Senator Stephanie Chang plans to introduce legislation that would ban seclusion and allow physical restraint only in emergency situations when necessary to prevent imminent serious bodily harm. The proposal will also require districts with high rates of restraint to develop plans for reducing its use and would provide certain school staff with additional training related to trauma and learning. While there is a broad agreement about reducing reliance on these practices, there is a disagreement about whether seclusion should be banned entirely. Some special education administrators argue that it still may be necessary in certain emergency situations and emphasize the need for more training in de-escalation, co-regulation, and trauma-informed practices.
I think the most helpful part of this, and I'm sure that you would agree, is the training part because just
100%.
because just having it on paper that it's only going to be used in emergency situations, you know, seen it in advocacy meetings where we're
Hmm.
talking about restraints that were done and it was made to seem like it was an emergency situation. And then you hear it and you're like, that doesn't sound
Right.
like an emergency situation. So just having the option of restraint on the table makes it very likely that it will be overused.
Yes.
So I think that a ton of training is really required so that the people that are working with these children who might be more likely to become extremely dysregulated and possibly aggressive toward themselves or others, that you have a really, really good, consistent training for them. Because that's the thing that's going to let them rely on it more, not just saying you can't use it unless it's an emergency. Because unless
Hmm.
they feel confident that they can handle a situation without a restraint, they are still going to use the restraint, and they're in their mind, they're gonna think that this was the only option, when
Yeah.
really had they had more training, that's going to be the thing that decreases it. And
And
for the seclusion, I know that people feel some way or the other way, about it, so I think that's a tricky one. That's a tricky
yeah,
one. Once again, I'm sure there's overuse.
I think, yeah, you brought up the advocacy meetings, but I've often thought about this actually. I was restraint trained when I was a special education teacher back in the day. And I just remember I was called in to support when needed. But
Mhm.
like I was never there for the de escalation pieces of it. By the time I was there, it might have been like 3 minutes later. Like, what did it look like? Were
Mhm.
those teachers trained in proper techniques until somebody that was restraint trained got there? We talk so much about restraining, but I think the education really needs to be like whole school environment for those de-escalation techniques. And I think that's really the missing piece here
Mhm.
because I can remember countless times when I would arrive at a situation and I was given feedback from somebody, but they were really escalated themselves and the student had some needs and they were escalated. And then I got involved and I was trying to de-escalate, but it had already been 3 to 5 minutes later. And then there were countless times that I had to get involved and do some restraints because the child was not physically safe to themselves or to others. However, I just think that there needs to be more education and de escalation training, co regulation, and trauma informed practices that everybody can have the buy in. And, it's larger than restraining. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, absolutely,
So
I agree. Our third story comes from Disability Scoop and the Dallas Morning News. As Texas begins the inaugural year of its Education Freedom Accounts program, some families of students with disabilities are finding that receiving a school voucher doesn't necessarily make finding an appropriate private school easier. Students with disabilities can receive significant funding through the program, but families interviewed for the story encountered a number of obstacles. For some, the voucher didn't cover the full cost of the tuition. Others struggled to find schools that could meet their child's specific needs or had space available. And even when families found a school that worked, transportation and other expenses could create additional challenges. The story also raises an important issue for families considering private school. Students who are parentally placed in private schools do not have the same individual entitlement to special education services under the IDEA that students in public schools have. For some of the families featured, the program has opened a door to an educational setting they believe will better serve their child. But for others, finding an accessible and affordable option remains a challenge still.
I think, I mean, my first reaction was a question.
Mhm.
I know that we've worked with some families who have privately placed their children and it's been a better program for them, etc. But for the families whose vouchers do not fully cover the tuition,
Mhm.
is there any supplemental? I think a lot of parents wonder this. Like, is there any supplemental funding stream or like recourse, or does the gap just fall entirely on the family? And it's like, that might be the most ideal school for you, but it's just not going to work out. So it's somewhere else. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think the voucher, you get what you get, and sometimes, like they said, it doesn't cover the whole thing. I'm
Yeah.
sure there are sometimes other like private grants and things like that or scholarships that parents can apply for to fill in
Yeah.
those gaps, but is it readily available to all parents? That are probably not, is
Yeah.
what I would assume.
Right.
So, it really does shine a light. We have a couple other stories on here that are going to be about school
Yeah.
choice and
About
things like
this.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the week for it. It seems like in the news. So I was like, you know what? This is something that it's really interesting because sometimes you do find a private school option that you fall in love with it and you're like, this is the perfect fit for my child. And my child also has a disability. So it's good to know what protections you have and what protections you give up when you
Hmm.
make that choice to privately place your child.
Right.
So this just shows something that, it can be hard to close that gap, that financial gap that's there sometimes, and it's something to be aware of when you're looking at schools that are private schools for your child. And also that, yeah, unlike a public school, they don't have to accept you into a
Right.
private school
Right.
if they don't feel like it's a good fit.
Right. Right.
And that can be something that's a bit shocking to parents when they're used to being in a public school and they have to meet your child's needs, whereas a private school does not have that legal obligation.
Right, and I can assume that parents, when they're in this predicament of like, what should I choose? I would never have the opportunity if I were not given this voucher. But at the same token, like, but I don't know if my kids' needs are going to be completely met if I take this risk. So I feel like you have to look at the whole child. Obviously, it's much more than just being accepted. It's what will that look like for the child and whether or not they can achieve the most success in that environment.
Mhm.
Okay, our fourth story comes from ULRN Public Media, and it looks at a new tool attempting to address one of those challenges that we just talked about up above. A Florida parent has created a website called Tegan AI to help families of children with disabilities to identify schools that may meet their child's needs. Parents answer questions about their location, their child's age and disability diagnosis, if they have one, and the types of supports they need, such as behavioral services or occupational therapy. The platform then can generate a list of private, charter, or virtual schools offering services that may match those needs. Families can also see whether a school accepts a certain state voucher program. Tegan AI currently includes options in 33 Florida counties. It does not currently recommend traditional public schools, although its creator says that she is working with districts to add their services. The tool grew out of creator Cheyenne Gonzalez's own experiences searching for an appropriate school for her autistic son, Tegan, who has attended 3 different schools. Just want to start by saying, like, this lady's a genius. And I kind of wish I thought of it on my own. I think it is like it's going to be a tool that will help families across the United States. It is just thank you, Cheyenne, and thank you, Tegan, for your experience, your
Yeah, I
journey, I
mean,
should say.
I just had a conversation about private schools with a family yesterday and, trying to figure out how do I because they were trying to think if it was public or private that would be the best for their child and trying to figure out what school has what and how do we know if it's the right fit and what questions do we ask? And I mean, this sounds like a really wonderful tool because we've heard of parents in the past that in order to get this had to hire an educational consultant to like do all the research for them, get the list even. So I think that this just really opens up such access for
Hmm.
families of children with disabilities to just know what their options are. Because what a
Right.
beautiful thing to just have that knowledge and know what schools are out there.
Yep.
And then you can
Yep.
figure out the rest of the stuff too. But you also want to know just what's available. That's the first step to being informed is you just know what your options are. So I love this
Right.
idea.
Yeah, me too. So hopefully we'll be able to continue to just follow this trajectory and that Cheyenne decides to start expanding and we will be her biggest supporter. So,
Okay. Our final story this week comes from America Magazine and continues our conversation about what meaningful school choice can look like for a student with disabilities. The story examines a small but growing number of Catholic schools around the country that are developing programs to serve students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The approaches vary considerably. Some schools are creating programs designed to include students with disabilities alongside their non disabled peers, while others provide more specialized programming. The article also highlights Notre Dame School of Dallas, which exclusively serves students with developmental disabilities. A 2026 survey from the National Catholic Partnership on Disability found that about 18% of responding Catholic school principals said their school had served at least one student with an intellectual disability. But only 224 institutions responded, compared with roughly 5,800 Catholic schools nationwide. So the results don't provide a complete national picture. The article makes clear that access remains inconsistent. Many families still struggle to find Catholic schools able or willing to serve their children, and even schools with established disability programs acknowledge that there are students whose needs they cannot accommodate. At the same time, the schools featured in the story demonstrate what can happen when communities intentionally invest in making students with disabilities a part of their school life.
I think it's a good story to end on. Obviously, it's again talking about school choice. I think it also is kind of like an eye opener again that the more options existing, if it's Catholic, if it's private, doesn't necessarily mean that those options are actually accessible for any given child. It depends on the child's disability. I think it's wonderful that more and more private and more Catholic schools are trying to be more inclusive, specifically in regards to learning disabilities and just providing some additional supports, executive functioning supports within their school, maybe like basic accommodations just to make things a little bit more inclusive. But again, it depends on the school. It's not a unanimous thing. It's skewed a little bit, and this article actually showed it. It doesn't mean that every Catholic school is going to have the same supports. So
Yeah. I mean, I grew up going to Catholic school, and so I feel like this is a really great story because I do remember being a kid and kind of overhearing conversations about a classmate or two that ended up
Mhm.
having to go to different schools because their needs couldn't be supported. And I always thought, oh, that stinks, or that's scary that they can just kind of kick you out if you don't do good here. Child brain, that was my process. I was like, you mean kick you out? But,
Yeah.
looking back, I'm like, right, because they didn't have an obligation to support that student's needs. And unfortunately, they could say, this is not a right fit. And
Right.
I think, like you said, I think it's really great that a lot more private schools are going, hey, how can we support students with disabilities? And asking them that question asking themselves that question that they need to ask, which is, well, what kind of disabilities can we support adequately, right? Who
Right.
can we do
Right.
a good job supporting as well? Is it a student that has a learning disability? Is it a student with mobility needs? Like, what can we do and what's realistic for us as a school to support these students? So
Yeah.
I think,
Getting that early on, even if it's through website or open houses, but just being very upfront. There's a school near me, and parents, when they went to the open house, particularly those children who were on a 504 or an IEP, they went to this private school, and the private school basically said, like, this is what, like, individually for
Mhm.
every single family that they met with, they said, this is what your kid was receiving. This is what we can continue with. This is what we can't continue with. And just like, you need to understand, like, if you ask for this, we're telling you up front, our school cannot provide those resources for your child. So I just think, like, there's no gray areas. It was very black and white. And if your child was, able to take that risk or, that plunge and be a little bit more independent without certain accommodations and modifications, then that's wonderful. But I think it's also very helpful for parents who know deep down or know from conversations with previous staff that the child requires a certain level of supports, and it might not be their appropriate placement for your child. Research, ask the questions, don't hesitate, talk about your child, talk about their strengths, weaknesses, and have them be very upfront. Ask those questions that you're just really unsure about, and don't assume anything is really the takeaway, I
yeah.
think.
And for those private schools, right there, I mean, a good first step is just integrating some professional development that talks about how to support the learners that are in your classroom right now. Because I guarantee that even though they're not saying that they're accepting or equipped for certain disabilities, I guarantee that there still are children who have some kind of disability in their school, but they're just not getting the accommodations for it. So sometimes just
Absolutely.
getting that professional development and easing yourself into the idea of like, okay, if this is what our student body is made up of right now, how can we support the students that we have right here? It doesn't mean going all in and being like, okay, so now we have to hire an in-house OT and this and that. No, it can just really look like supporting your own educators by making them better at differentiation and learning some accommodations that you can put in place. So
Sure. And we have dealt with many schools, particularly this past year. There's a great school that we're working with right now in New York that has implemented a lot of this professional development based off of our findings and just, they really want to make it more inclusive, but within the parameters that their school mission is set out to be. So, anyways, keep up the good work for anybody that's trying to be a little bit more inclusive. And, anyways, that's this week's top stories in special education. If you'd like to read more about any of the stories that we discussed today, be sure to check out this week's edition of the Special Education News and Noteworthy newsletter, where we've linked each of the original articles.
And remember, the newsletter goes beyond the 5 headlines we discuss here on the podcast. This week, we're taking a closer look at the theme running through several of these stories, which is, when is school choice really a choice for students with disabilities? We're talking about the difference between simply having more options and having options that are actually accessible, affordable, and appropriate for an individual child. You'll also find our picks of the week and additional resources exclusively in the newsletter.
And if you're finding these conversations helpful, please follow Special Education News and Noteworthy wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating. It really does help more families, educators, and advocates discover the show. And if you know someone who would benefit from these conversations, we'd love for you to share the podcast with them. Thanks so much for spending your week with us. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay vocal, and take care of yourself.
Bye, everyone.